Hello, everybody in person and online. I would like to welcome you to the case for Paratopian design with Dr. Rilla Khaled. I'm Jen Whitson. I'm an associate prof here at the University of Waterloo. And I'm going to take a few moments for administrivia to talk about the Institute and give some context to the land on which we work on. For those of you who aren't familiar, I think it's just a small fraction, maybe zero of you, but the Games Institute, or the GI, is a research institute at the University of Waterloo that's home to interdisciplinary researchers who seek to advance the study, the design, and purpose of interactive and immersive technologies and experiences, especially playful ones. And our research, of course, includes games like the ones we're going to discuss today, but includes interactive and immersive media at large. So we're expanding. And we endeavored to be a place where researchers from all backgrounds can come together and work together and learn from each other beyond the boundaries of the discipline. And so I'm going to start with a territorial acknowledgement. It's important for us at the Games Institute to recognize the enduring presence and the deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share the land that we live and work on. We're working to continually make the space for Indigenous scholars, designers, commenters, creators, and students, and to uplift all voices that are marginalized in both the academic and gaming communities. And so here at the GI, we acknowledge that the land in which we work and live today is the traditional land of the Arawandran, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee people. And the University of Waterloo, where we work, is situated on the Haldimand Tract, which includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. My own family settled on Treaty 7 land and farmed next to Alexander First Nations in Alberta. And so we have a responsibility as such beneficiaries to acknowledge and understand both the history, our history, and the current experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and for this understanding to inform the work that we do so that we can stop perpetuating the damages of colonization and start to repair them. And so land acknowledgements and planting pawpaw trees and doing all sorts of things like this to restore the land within which we live are just one very small first step in doing this work. And so if you want to learn more about the GI or our commitment to anti-racism, decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion, check out the GI website pages, which we link to in the chat. So finally, we're here at the moment. We are joined by Dr. Rilla Khaled. She's an associate professor of design and computational arts at Concordia University in Montreal. She directs the Technoculture Arts and Games Research Center, TAG. Her work focuses on playful media and how it can improve our daily life. And it spans designing award-winning games, creating speculative prototypes of near future technologies, working with BIPOC communities to materialize inclusive futures, establishing foundations for recoverable materials-based game design research, and articulating the boundaries for experimental uses of AI. And I've known Rilla for many years, more than a decade. When I was a grad student, she was the postdoc. Her and Pippin were the postdoc that I looked up to, and we're doing all of the cool things like creating locative games, like Story Trek. They were doing haptic tabletop cooking games, making sandwiches before that was cool. And Rilla and Pippin have always been at the cutting edge of game making and always have been doing the coolest and the most inspiring work and also the most thought-provoking work. And so without further ado, I would like you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Rilla.
Hey, thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Jen, thank you for that introduction. Before I launch into the talk, I feel like I need to give a little correction. I'm not director of TAG as of August. I've handed over that mantle to Darren Werschler, but I'm still around as associate director, so still very much involved in TAG affairs. All right, let's get on to the talk. So the title of the talk is The Case for Paratopian Design. And all of this thinking grew out of an FRQSC funded research creation project called Speculative Play. And that project was about merging together two schools of design thought: playful media and game design on the one hand, and speculative and critical design on the other. So this type of design is closer to contemporary art than mass-produced design. And the subject matter that it tends to deal with is frequently complicated, nuanced, and on occasion provocative. So this is my former student Theo Chauviry's speculation on how to build urban transit infrastructure with biodegradable renewable resources. So almost everything in this speculative metro car is made from mycelium. Theo literally grew this metro car in a lab. And this mycelium prototype is classic speculative design. It's kind of weird on initial inspection, but it asks a serious question. What if we used biodegradable materials for urban infrastructure? But as someone with a history of working with games and interaction design, I'm interested in amplifying this kind of rhetoric with audience participation and playfulness. So specifically, I think about this. How might we leverage playful and digital interactions to bring complex social and cultural questions to life? And can you do this in a way that brings experiences to people beyond universities, galleries, and the ivory towers that our community has ready access to? But this is jumping the gun. We can't answer that question without thinking through what speculative and critical design entail, which I'll do in the form of an ordered series of propositions. So, 1, speculative and critical design, or SCDs, propose alternative visions of the world through object rhetoric. The thinking is that by drawing attention to alternative visions, people will end up critically thinking about how the world currently is. Because SCDs frequently take the form of objects, the manifestation or evocation of possible worlds is expressed through the functionality that is proposed by these objects. So Datatum is the work of my former student Milo Reinhardt, in which he posed the question: who should control our digital data after we die? Should that data be buried or destroyed, mirroring what happens to our bodies? His work proposes a certain type of functionality, which is archiving all of one's personal data after death, which in turn gestures to an alternative world in which that functionality makes sense. Often, the functionality doesn't exist, or rather, it doesn't exist here and now. So this is Cook Your Way, an alt controller game by my PhD student, Enrique Llagostera. So Cook Your Way asks us to imagine if obtaining immigration to new countries boils down to our ability to cook exotic dishes for our new countries. Cook Your Way is real and functional within its diegetic world, but it's not functional within this world. SCDs grew out of the cracks between interaction design, industrial design, and art in the late 90s and early 2000s, kickstarted by Anthony Dunn, Fiona Raby, James Auger, Julian Bleecker, and others. And it's set against a backdrop of consumer-oriented design, or as Dunn and Raby would call it, affirmative design. And crucially, SCDs are defined in opposition to many of the qualities we associate with consumer-oriented design. So instead of focusing on problem solving, coming up with answers, optimizing for production, and assuming the user as a target, the focus is on problem finding, asking questions, focusing on societal needs as opposed to production, and thinking about people as opposed to users. So on to point 2. Best practice advice for speculative and critical design suggests that there's a sweet spot for contextualizing or situating an experience, the space between familiar and unfamiliar. Too familiar, and the concept will be understandable but boring. Too unfamiliar, and the concept might be interesting but irrelevant. And my term for this Goldilocks spot is the uncanny design valley. To be clear, normally best practice advice is to avoid the uncanny valley, but in the case of SCDs, it's actually beneficial. Why? Well, people are quite good at noticing slight irregularities, and this harkens back to Viktor Shklovsky's observations about defamiliarization, or making the familiar strange. Shklovsky's claim was that when we make things a little unfamiliar, we can't operate on autopilot and we bother to pay attention, while still retaining enough understanding or expertise to not be totally derailed. With SCDs, you want to target an uncanny valley outside of here and now, which is made uncanny because it includes modifications and edits to facts, the course of science, cultural and societal norms, laws and rules, or the perspectives that history is told through. When experiencing an SCD, people shouldn't feel totally out of place, but they should feel like they're on the back foot. And as learning science has argued, when we feel unsure, we're more motivated to pay attention and engage in critical thinking. So moving on, when SCDs first started emerging about 20 years ago, they followed a distinct design vernacular, flawless looking products that looked like they came from a near future. And a seminal example is the audio tooth implant designed by James Auger in 2002. So to borrow Auger's own description, the audio tooth implant is a radical new concept in personal communication. A miniature audio output device and receiver are implanted into the tooth during routine dental surgery. These offer a form of electronic telepathy as the sound information resonates directly into the consciousness. Auger had no plans to actually build or release this as a product. It was a speculative design about cybernetic body modification. But divorced from their fictional framings, SCDs can be misinterpreted as real. Journalists who wrote about Auger's implant got complaints from doctors about the moral decay that such dental technology would cause. So herein lies the rub for SCDs. If, like this doctor, you weren't privy to the fictional packaging, you might get irritated at the stupid ideas that designers come up with. So SCDs need to be closely bound to their diegetic fiction, or their rhetoric can be misinterpreted. But this connects to another point about SCDs concerning their functionality. SCDs always convey some kind of function, but it's often the case that it's a communicated function as opposed to one that you can personally experience. So let's take Milo's Datatome. For Datatome, and this is true of many SCDs in fact, the function remained in the realms of the conceptual. So you're not going to find a Datatome service online. Appearances might suggest that the functionality is real, but in fact, you're usually dealing with layers of technical wizardry, which are there to evoke or mimic the function. And the term design prototype doesn't quite suffice here either, because design prototypes are often understood as interim tools as opposed to final propositions. And this is exactly why my collaborator Pippin Barr and I started wondering about games and playful media as vehicles for SCDs. With games, we can use expressive interactivity to convey and simulate functions in the context of game world fictions. So both function and fiction can be bound together. And depending on platforms and technical requirements, access and circulation can be fairly wide. So in 2017, Pippin released It Is As If You Were Doing Work, or simply Work. And work conveys functions within a fiction. It presents itself as an application to give a sense of purpose to the idle humans of a near future in which all work has been delegated to robots. And it takes the form of a 90s Windows-style desktop environment with Office-like tasks to be performed through the manipulation of standard UI elements. So work is an SCD motivated by the question of what is work for if it's no longer about getting things done. Work is also a web game which has been played by over 500,000 people, which is hands down a larger number than what it would have been had this only been on show at our university. So I'll go as far as to say that games seem like they should be amazing vehicles for SCDs. But there's a problem that we've actually brought on ourselves. After several decades of explosive growth and maturation of the expressive capacities of games and what we dare to represent with them, it's become hard for anything to remain weird. Everything has been defamiliarized, to echo Joanna Drucker's claim about visual art in contemporary times. But whereas Drucker suggests that we've become immune or numb to alienating images, in games, we're not immune, we normalize. So 2 examples from the simulation game House Flipper. I can sell and remove things around me. Does it work on the door? Yes, it works on the door. Oh, well, it looks like I can't actually leave anymore. Well, that's okay. I'll just buy a new one when I need it. All right, here's another example. I need to mow this lawn, but it's so huge. Oh, I can do high-speed WASD mowing, and it looks like I can't damage anything. So I might as well also watch Drag Race All-Stars while I mow this lawn. When we play, we're so good at normalizing weird and then optimizing it that game contents almost don't matter anymore. Any experience we have of uncanny design valley as expressed via a game system gradually disappears as we work out the rules of play and as we become enculturated within that game system. Weird always becomes the new normal. So from weird lawn mowing, let's move on to design dystopias, and specifically to Neocub, which is a dystopian SCD that I designed with my project team. I live in Quebec, which happens to have legislation in place that bans niqab, which is the full face cover that some Muslim women wear. And as a Muslim woman living in Canada, it's a political issue that I have personal stakes in. So Neocub is an experience that poses questions about how we deal with religious diversity in secular Western countries. The fiction of Neocub presents a dystopian technology for cultural and religious tolerance, but it mostly targets Muslim women who wear niqab. The Neocub technology enables censoring and, in a sense, uncensoring of people whose faces are covered. So you can force a face onto someone who didn't want to be seen. And we simulated this function using a Kinect, projection, and a swipe-based mobile UI. And the rhetorical intention here is not to convince people that this is an effective product or even a good idea. It's to make people reflect on their community and society's stance towards visible religious difference and our own boundaries regarding tolerance. And the rhetoric operates at a visceral and experiential level as well. People have to literally edit away someone's face as they stand near them. There's no hiding behind the law, and that's just how we do things. The design intention is to make what is mandated at the legislative societal level be enacted at the individual level. I want to reiterate, what we propose through NeoCub is a terrible solution. I'm not advocating that we make this thing real. It's most definitely dystopian design. And I'll be the first to admit, dystopian design is fun. It invites you to lean all the way in, to let go. But when I started testing NeoCub, I encountered the phenomenon that I now think of as the woke problem. So when you undertake play tests or user tests with people who coexist around you in a university or research setting, those people will more or less share your political leanings. There was a lot of head nodding as I explained my design motivations during a debrief session. Perhaps too much head nodding for the design to have done anything other than making people uncomfortable. And in part, this is because the people who I were testing on were not so different from me. And in part, it was also because the fictional world cast around NeoCub was clearly dystopian. Dystopian design is the final word. It's a mic drop. And how do you talk back to a mic drop? In this way, dystopian design is fun, but it's irresponsible. And it means that we leave the burden of articulating alternatives on the shoulders of our audiences, which is, arguably kind of lazy. The other problem with dystopias is that it's too easy for the audience to work out a story where it doesn't apply to them. There's a psychology model about attitude change that supports this line of reasoning. And this is the elaboration likelihood model, or the ELM. The ELM postulates how persuasion and behavior change happen. If we think something doesn't apply to us, we're not motivated to expend effort thinking about it because by and large, we're pretty lazy when it comes to thinking. And so we do a minimal job of thinking, and instead we rely on surface level heuristics to shortcut having to think. We let ourselves off the hook. Okay, so if we're avoiding dystopias, what do we have left? I mean, we probably don't want to design utopias because those are impossible, doomed to fail. So what's left? Well, fortunately, all the space in between. Okay, so lateral alternatives and possible parallel worlds. For argument's sake, let's call those paratopias. Okay, so let's take a look at a paratopian design that grew out of speculative play work. So Shabo is a ChatGPT-powered chatbot that serves as a therapist of sorts. Shabo employs a therapy approach that is equal parts cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. Shabo is also a flirt, in as much as a chatbot can be a flirt. When the flirtation setting is set to the max, it adopts language used by pickup artists. If any of you are familiar with Reeves and Nass's book, The Media Equation from the 90s, they demonstrated that people enjoy flattery even if they know it's pre-programmed and originates from a computer. So Shabo takes the idea of flattery to a PG-13, gross pickup artist kind of level. So the speculative question that the Shabo experiment proposes is, what if some parts of mental health care could be offloaded to AI? And by not including a human in that specific loop, what new behaviors can we now explore that we would normally rule out because of human-to-human standards for ethics and professionalism, which previously off-the-table behaviors might actually have potentially positive outcomes? So you might at this point say, this is just semantics. Is Shabo paratopian? Or why is a paratopia any different from a dystopia? Well, paratopias are not characterized by obvious undesirability. And the prefix para is doing more work than simply reminding you of sideways. It's also there to evoke paradigm shift. Think of a paratopia like the present world, except there's 1 to 2 paradigm shifts of separation between what we currently have here and now and the projected paratopia. And when I say paradigm here, I want to evoke a sociocultural take on Thomas Kuhn's idea of scientific paradigms, which is to say frameworks and philosophies that we currently subscribe to that explain how we think the world works. So by embedding SCDs within projected paratopias, our design work could have greater payoffs, and the design situations we bring to life could perhaps, maybe, lead to different ways of doing things here and now. So speaking of connecting to here and now, within 2 days of posting my code for Shabo on a public GitHub repository, I was contacted by a company who said they were also exploring GP3 CBT solutions, and they asked, could we consider collaborating? And I wrote back to them to say, well, it's still early days, but meanwhile, I was thinking, I don't think that my Shabo is what you had in mind. But that is also when it occurred to me that Shabo almost isn't a speculative design if other people are seriously considering something like it as a commercially viable product. And this largely becomes possible because the core functionality that Shabo builds on, which is the ability to emulate a human-sounding conversation partner who brings up expert-level domain knowledge, this is handled by OpenAI's API services. And there's nothing unusual about doing this. Any software developer you ever meet will default to doing this type of code reuse and extension as much as possible, whether in the form of borrowing actual code, using existing software frameworks, or building on top of APIs. All of this leads to faster implementation that is usually more robust. But the pragmatics of building on existing technical layers almost breaks the idea of SCDs because the functionality of the thing being evoked may actually function here and now exactly as claimed. With Shabo, you don't just have an emulated experience of talking to an AI chatbot therapist. You really do just talk to an AI chatbot therapist. The evoked function actually functions as claimed, and the fictional aspect now only describes the context of use. And because we built Shabo on top of a proper API layer, we quite naturally fell into a kind of Donald Schoen conversation with materials design approach, where your design decisions are as much driven by whatever you had in mind at the beginning and backtalk, what your design materials want to do when they're put into conversation with you and with each other. So by virtue of using and working with known materials, we fell into a conversation with materials approach to Paratopian design, which essentially took the following form. So first of all, implement a partial feature. So in our case, this was a UI layer to chat to Shabo. 2, use it until it's no longer interesting. So in our case, we became familiar with where it broke down, where it was clear you were no longer talking to a human, and where we encountered design flaws, sort of classic UX design flaws. 3, consider what other design standards it ought to be in conversation with. So in our case, this was input mechanisms, standard UX web input mechanisms, so sliders, radio buttons, emoji responses. And then 4, connect it to those existing UX standards. So a conversation with materials approach and Paratopian design will inevitably lead to stitching together between the projected Paratopia and here and now, bringing the two of them closer together. Okay, so Shabo and Neocub were both the result of me having an idea and wanting to flesh it out further, which is a common way that the design of SCDs gets approached. Most often, they've been associated with a kind of auteur design sensibility. But if SCDs are about engaging critical thinking amongst a broad audience, then it's worth exploring whether we can make them in participatory ways. In the late 1970s, the futurist Robert Jung and his colleagues invented a workshop process that had the objective of empowering communities to co-create their futures. And these workshops are now simply known as future workshops. So I used future workshops for another speculative play sub-project called Aunties and Algorithms, which is a near future algorithmically assisted online matrimonial platform for people based in India. Why, you might be asking? Why marriage as subject matter for a speculative play project? Well, there are few life events that capture and are captured by culture and protocol as much as marriage. Growing up as a Bangladeshi in New Zealand, I remember the first time I encountered a biodata document in its physically mediated form as a singular sheet of A4. If you've never seen biodata like this before, think of it as a Tinder profile, which is written by parents and traditionally exchanged along their non-digital social networks for the purpose of finding their child a life partner. So what power was ascribed to that one sheet of A4? And what power our non-digital networks had in terms of whose biodata might end up in our hands? So in the Aunties and Algorithms project, the underlying design research question is, as more people turn towards the internet and algorithmic matching to seek life partners, can we reimagine the assumptions of online matchmaking in ways that move beyond linear extensions of biodata and newspaper ads? And what design trajectories can we develop from how young Indians think about marriage today and what they want for the future? But in setting out to do this project, it was rapidly evident to me that I can't develop this idea on my own or even with my team. The idea exists within a paratopia, and that needs to be developed by people who could inhabit that paratopia. So back to future workshops. My team and I ran a series of workshops with participants based around the Bangalore area in the 20 to 30 year age group to get a feel for how they and their peers think about relationships, marriage, and the role of the family, both right now as well as in the near future. Future workshops have 3 main stages. The first phase, the critique phase, involves communities analyzing their situations critically and identifying pain points as they would be described in the language of UX. So in week 1, we had our participants respond to themes that we had found in earlier qualitative research about Indian youth and their experiences and perceptions related to relationships and marriage. And we also had them design online profiles for themselves. The second phase, the fantasy phase, involves identifying a vision of the future where those pain points are no longer of concern. So in week 2, we had our participants write near future fiction narratives about their children getting married. Then we had them brainstorm and design speculative platforms that exist in the future. The third phase, the implementation phase, involves working forward from the critique phase to the fantasy phase and also backwards from the fantasy phase to the critique phase to work out what the biggest obstacles are and then to come up with workarounds. So in week 3, we had our participants work with the narratives and the future platforms that they developed in week 2 to prototype platforms they might want to use now or in the very near future. So over those 3 weeks, my team and our participants undertook travels together, both in time to the future and back, and also in space to the Paratopia and back. We developed trust, shared language, shared understanding, and a shared perspective of that Paratopia. And core insights we took away from this process include the following. Young people wanted to significantly involve their families in the process of finding a life partner but they cared about identity separation. So what their family knew about them and what their peer group knew about them. And also when there were large differences between who their family would choose for them and who they would choose for themselves, it was often due to differences in value priorities. And it can be very difficult to acknowledge and even articulate value differences. So as such, we thought about the following. What if there were 2 types of account? One for the person seeking to get matched, where the profile info is totally editable, and another for a parent or family member, but with a limited view of the profile's full data component, but still the possibility to recommend matches. And what if the system, through its different views and ways of algorithmically determining matches, could facilitate some of these difficult conversations about value differences, about traditions, and about the many different identities we embody and present at different times. In speculating on what a near future matrimonial system ought to be, but tangibly linking the concept to people's expectations from now. So, and by this I mean biodata, well-known platforms like shadi.com. So Aunties and Algorithms is drawing on these existing artifacts, these existing platforms. So it's creating familiar links, it's drawing on familiar threads between here and now and the Paratopian world that is still fairly similar to this one. And because of these familiar threads, people are also more able to give open feedback, to discuss consequences and consider ramifications. If the point of this type of design is to invite consideration, well, conversation and consideration from audiences, then we should continuously remember the design needs to stem from their existing literacies. Okay, so about threads. So one of the research assistants on my speculative play team is my PhD student, Chip Lineburner, who also happens to be an escape room designer. I tasked Chip with planning a kind of test apparatus around NeoCup, and we proceeded to have essentially the following conversation. Chip, what character should I play when I experience NeoCup? Me. Play yourself. But I wouldn't use this thing. I'm ethically against what NeoCup suggests as a solution. So who am I when I use this? Oh, right. Well, just use it. As a Muslim woman, I give you permission to do this. And then we both went into a kind of awkward silence as we thought about the history of the world and the history of the world and how to respectfully tell your boss that you think she's in the wrong. And then it struck me, new idea, you play someone who has to critically analyze and reflect on NeoCup, to which Chip responded, that I can do. And as uncomfortable as that exchange was, it's how I started thinking about onboarding design as applied to SCDs. You might be familiar with the notion of onboarding design from a UX context. It's sort of like a tutorial stage where there's a meta voice explaining what things are and how to use them. So we came up with a roughly analogous design stage for NeoCub. So NeoCub now gets presented as an app that has been submitted to a fictional distribution platform called PocketNet. Audience members are assigned the role of content policy violation moderator, where the task of content moderation concerns verifying that an app's contents do not violate PocketNet's content publishing guidelines. So this is not unlike real roles that exist on familiar distribution platforms like the App Store or Steam. So audience members are given PocketNet's guidelines to evaluate NeoCub against, and they have to enter a written report into a web-based system that uses familiar language, familiar policy, familiar UI conventions, and familiar web content, including a Google form. Playing this fictional role is less likely to present an ideological clash with people's ideas about themselves. The role also demands that audience members exercise analysis, which is hopefully critical. So to return to Chip's question again, what character should people be playing when they experience NeoCub? The answer is you play a content moderator who must assess whether NeoCub ought to be released to the public. A useful metaphor for thinking about this type of onboarding is an airlock. Airlocks are sealed off compartments between environments of differing pressure conditions. They have doors to the different environments that do not open at the same time, and they have seals. And a lock helps its inhabitants acclimate to the environment that they're about to enter. So if locks are about acclimatization, then we can ask, what do you need your design audience to know and to assume? Who do you need them to be? And how do you assist the blurring of their everyday identity with their diegetic role? Well, it turns out that LARPers deal with blurring of identity all the time. So here's the fastest and loosest introduction to role-playing theory you're ever going to encounter, because I'm just about to borrow their terminology. Okay, so within LARP circles, people talk about bleed when there's a carryover of experience either from player to LARP character or from LARP character to player. And the classic example of bleed is the LARP crush, or emotional bleed, when the feelings characters have for each other in game, for instance, characters who are lovers, so Bella and Edward from Twilight, for instance, when those feelings carry over to players' feelings for each other outside of the game. So Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson ended up together in real life for a few years. If anyone mentions bleed, of course you'll think of blood, but ink is another substance that famously bleeds. So consider what happens when you hold an inky pen down on paper. Something like that, right? Especially if your paper is thin. So the wisdom of fountainpenlove.com tells us bleeding occurs when ink soaks through a piece of paper to the other side. Ink might soak through onto the next piece of paper or even the surface you're writing on. And this turns out to be quite a nice metaphor for explaining LARP bleed. If ink is analogous to the play experience and paper is the boundaries of the magic circle. I bring up the magic circle because it roughly overlaps with another very important LARP concept, which is alibi. Alibi is more complicated to explain than bleed, so allow me to unleash a definition from the Nordic LARP wiki. So, alibi can include individual legitimizing strategies which enable players to interact and reconstruct a socially acceptable spectrum of play. So it's a negotiation of what is acceptable to do in a certain LARP. And the same page proposes, alibi is what makes the player able to do the LARP, but also what legitimizes his actions after the LARP to the world and to himself. We agreed it was okay to do X, so it is okay that I did it. Alibi and bleed are oppositional and complementary. So bleed is your day-to-day self melding into the play experience, An alibi is what allows you to play in ways that don't conform to your ideas of you. The stronger your alibi, the less likely you'll experience bleed, and the weaker your alibi, the more likely you'll experience bleed. All right, lesson over, but the main point. Bleed and alibi are useful design tools, especially for thinking through diegetic framing in SCDs. So now we're finally in a position to put these LARP ideas to use. SCDs can be about anything at all, so long as they're not too far away from here and now, or what is familiar. In any SCD, there should be residual thought about the diegetic world after experiencing it. If the character you set up for your audience or players is fairly innocuous, or the diegetic assumptions aren't obviously offensive, you can get away with dropping audience members into the diegetic world, but keep the idea of threads in mind. Make the design experience familiar enough that your audience can intuit what to do. Alibi here is weak, so some degree of bleed is likely. If, however, your diegetic assumptions are provocative or difficult, design for onboarding and acclimatize your audience in a design airlock. And this acclimatization should give your audience an alibi. You can still have a core design experience that gets people to explore difficult scenarios, but now it happens between onboarding and offboarding phases. Spontaneously occurrent bleed will be weaker, but the alibi you provide helps compensate for bleed. And as all good serious game designers know anyway, you will magnify and multiply the effects of any diegetic learnings when you include something like a post-play debrief session. Okay, audience, we've covered much terrain over the past 40-odd minutes, so let's retrace where we've been. All right, so 1, SCDs propose alternative visions of the world through the lens of objects. They grow best in uncanny design valleys, places that are somewhat estranged from here and now. They operate in the context of particular fictions and can be misinterpreted outside of those fictions. It's often difficult to experience an SCD's function for various pragmatic reasons, which is why games and interaction design inspired SCDs are really promising. Though, games normalize weird, and that's not necessarily helpful for SCDs. All right, next, dystopias are common in SCDs, but straight dystopias don't leave much room for dialogue. Paratopias, or paradigm-shifted presence, give us a diegetic target that moves us out of the dystopia-utopia binary. And Paratopian design can be tethered to here and now via threads in the form of engagement with existing technical or design standards. Participatory design likewise invokes threads in the form of audience lived experience. But threads alone aren't always enough, especially if your diegetic context is provocative. And in these cases, please consider using onboarding design. And last but not least, last and perhaps most, in SCDs, you always want bleed. And if you can't have it, then you need an alibi. And that gets us to the end, here and now. Thank you, everyone.
I was so excited about that last slide. I started clapping early. Rilla, brilliant talk. As people are mulling things over, I'm going to start reading questions from the chat, and I will go backwards. So the last question we had posted was thinking about the popular tweet on Torment Nexus, and the subtext is sci-fi author says, in my book, I invented the Torment Nexus as a cautionary tale. Tech company says, in response, at long last, we've created the Torment Nexus from classic sci-fi novel, Don't Create the Torment Nexus. And so the question is being aware of the potential uses of your designs for unauthorized commercial use that might be counter to your argument, is that part of an ethical responsibility of a critical speculative designer, especially for paratopias, if they feel more possible than dystopias, as you say? Like, should designers do something to decrease the probability of this happening?
I think that it does fall within our kind of ethical remit for sure. I had a conversation with a journalist a couple of years ago about neocarb, and I explained the whole thing to her. I thought she understood what the project was about, that I kind of wanted it to be an example of what not to do. But she then asked me, okay, so when is this thing going to be downloadable on the App Store? And I said, oh my God, that thing is never going to be downloadable on the App Store. Like, if I'm not there to control how it's being received, then I've done the world a disservice by, putting a piece of media out there that does not explain itself very well. So I think we definitely need to think through the ethics of just releasing media or ideas in the wild. But for that reason, I also became really interested in how can we build in hints towards the surrounding diegetic world? Like, how can we try and tether these things together, both the experiences that we want people to have and the evoked world? Because if people understand the evoked world, then they're more able to understand the critique as well. But when those things are divorced, then I don't know, maybe I made a super racist app. Like, that's what people would think about me.
Great response here. The other question that we had posted, and if there's anybody here in person that has questions, feel free to post it in the chat or raise your hands. Curious about the term paratopia and how it relates to what Foucault calls the heterotopias, which describe certain cultural, institutional, and discursive spaces that are somehow other or disturbing or intense or incompatible. How was that intentional? In that heterotopias are worlds within worlds, mirroring and yet upsetting what is outside. And so is it just, were you meaning to evoke heterotopias at all?
I wasn't necessarily meaning to evoke heterotopias per se. Like, in fact, but I will say in general, I want people to think about all of the topias. I want people to think of all possible worlds. I guess where I would not necessarily want to lean in too much is this idea of disturbing or incompatibility, or focusing too much on upsetness. I mean, I think that those can be qualities. I think that creating experiences that are troublesome or cause us discomfort one way or another, there are situations where it's valid for us to do that. But I also, like, for me, I really want designers to not just lean so hard into, oh, we'll just make the people feel bad. And through feeling bad, they can then work out how to feel better. I think as designers, part of what we do is we come up with solutions. We don't necessarily come up with the best solutions, but that's something that we're trained to do, is come up with lots of solutions. And for that reason, I'm sort of more into the idea of, okay, let's come up with parallel worlds that aren't necessarily negative or aren't necessarily woefully uncomfortable for us. Yeah, I think it's something that we as designers are really well placed to do. So yeah, that's my challenge to designers out there, is use your brain, come up with constructive ideas for the rest of us.
That is absolutely wonderful. Did anybody have any last questions while we are getting close to the hour? Could you recommend any articles? When is the paper coming out along with the slide, Rilla, on Paratopia in game design?
Okay, this is such a good question. Like the problem with a lot of this work is that like there exist a lot of these projects at this point, and I never actually tried to sit down and write this all up. So soon.
I would like to note for the record that that question came from the tag lab. So you are being poked. Consider yourself nudged.
Yeah.
And another note on the heterotopia, paratopia, Ursula Le Guin's ambiguous utopia might be another sort of part to throw in there as well in the chat. With that being said, thank you so much, Rilla, for such a fabulous, fabulous talk. These are all going to be recorded and posted on the Games Institute website, so we can rewatch it and distill all the things that were jammed into there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today online and in person, and we hope that you enjoyed the talk. If you have questions or comments, just email the Games Institute Ops Coordinator at the Games Institute at uwaterloo.ca. And we've dropped Dr. Khaled's links on where to find her in the chat and for more information there. Also, we would like to promote some of the things that are coming up. Next event in the series is Skins Deep, Race, Gender, and Nationality in Esports with Dr. Tara Fickle, who's going to be joining us in person on November 14th. Without any further ado, another round of applause for Rilla, and then we will set you off to go trick-or-treating. Thank you all. Thank you, Rilla.